A man stands on the America's Got Talent stage. He's 56 years old. Nobody knows his name. The audience sits silent. Then he opens his mouth, and something extraordinary happens. His voice is so powerful, so perfect, that the entire room goes still. But here's what shocked everyone. This man had been hiding something his entire life. For decades, he kept a secret that could have changed everything. And only now, at an age when most people have given up on dreams, is he finally telling the truth about who he really is and what he's always been capable of. Richard Goodall wasn't supposed to be on that stage. He was a school teacher from Indiana. 40 years of teaching music to kids. 40 years of standing in front of classrooms, watching other people chase their dreams while he went home and graded papers. Nobody in his town knew he could sing like this. Not his neighbors, not his colleagues, not even people who'd worked with him for decades. He was invisible, and that's exactly how he planned it. But something happens when you get to 56 years old. You start thinking about time differently. You start asking yourself questions you've been avoiding your whole life. What if? Why not? How much longer am I going to wait? So Richard did something most people never do. He auditioned for America's Got Talent. Not because he thought he'd win. Not because he had some grand plan to become famous. He did it because he could not do it anymore. The secret was too heavy. The dream was too loud. And then he walked onto that stage. The audience saw a middle-aged man in glasses. Ordinary. Unremarkable. A substitute teacher, maybe. Someone you'd pass in the grocery store without a second glance. The judges didn't recognize him. Why would they? He had no social media presence. No YouTube videos. No viral moments. He was completely unknown. Then he sang the opening notes of The Prayer. And everything stopped. It wasn't just good. It wasn't just impressive for his age. It was transcendent. The kind of voice that makes you forget to breathe. The kind of talent that shouldn't exist in a 56-year-old substitute teacher from a small Indiana town. His voice was pure, trained, powerful, professional. The kind of voice that belongs in concert halls and opera houses and record labels. The judges were stunned. One of them reached for the golden buzzer almost immediately. And in that single moment, Richard's entire life changed. Not because he suddenly became talented. He'd always been talented. But because the secret was finally out. This is where the story gets complicated. Because talent alone doesn't explain why a man would spend 5 decades hiding something this big. There had to be a reason. And when you dig into Richard's past, you find something that most people never expect to hear. Richard grew up in a different era. A time when certain dreams were considered unrealistic. When certain career paths were considered impractical. When a boy from a working-class family in Indiana wasn't supposed to think too big. His parents loved him, but they also lived in the real world. They knew what it took to survive. And singing, real singing, professional singing, that wasn't survival strategy. That was a luxury for people who had money, people from bigger cities, people who knew the right people. So Richard made a choice, a quiet choice, a choice he never really announced himself, but somehow lived by anyway. He would keep his voice to himself. He became a teacher instead. It made sense. It was stable. It was respectable. He could support a family. He could pay the bills. He could live a normal life. And he could sing, just not publicly, just not in a way that mattered, just not in a way that threatened the careful balance he created. For 40 years, he taught music to children. Think about that for a second. He spent 4 decades teaching other people's kids how to sing, how to perform, how to chase musical dreams, while burying his own dream deeper and deeper. His students never knew. They thought he was just a teacher who happened to know music. They didn't know he was teaching them the thing he'd sacrificed for himself. They didn't know he'd made peace with a life where his greatest gift would never be fully expressed. But peace isn't the same as happiness. And as Richard got older, something started to shift. He watched the students grow up. He watched some of them pursue music. He watched them have opportunities he never had. And he started to wonder, what if I'd been braver? What if I'd chosen differently? What if I'd just tried? By the time he turned 50, the question was becoming unbearable. The dream wasn't dying. It was screaming to get out. America's Got Talent reaches millions of people every single week. It's one of the biggest platforms in the world. But for Richard, it wasn't about the platform. It wasn't about becoming famous or winning a competition. It was about something much simpler and much more profound. It was about finally being heard. He didn't know if he'd make it past the first round. He didn't know if the judges would care. He didn't know if his voice would sound as good in a professional studio as it did in his car, or his shower, or the small church where he sang occasionally. But he knew he had to try. Because if he didn't try now, at 56, with less time ahead of him than behind him, he might never try at all. The audition itself was almost ordinary at first. He introduced himself. The judges made small talk. Nothing suggested what was about to happen. And then the music started and Richard opened his mouth, and the entire building seemed to hold its breath. Howie Mandel hit the golden buzzer. This doesn't happen very often. The golden buzzer is reserved for moments so rare, so undeniable, that the judges know instantly they're witnessing something special. And Howie didn't hesitate. He saw it immediately. This was a moment. But here's what made it even more powerful. Richard started crying. Not during the performance. He was too focused for that. But right after, when he realized what had just happened, when it finally sank in that his secret was out, that people had heard him, that they believed in him, that at 56 years old, his life was about to be completely different. The judges asked him why he never pursued singing professionally, and Richard's answer was honest in a way that resonated with millions of people watching at home. He talked about responsibility, about practical choices, about the life he'd built and the people he loved. He wasn't bitter about it. He wasn't angry. He was just reflective. He was a man looking back at his own life with a complicated mix of acceptance and regret. But something shifted in that moment. His story wasn't about failure anymore. It wasn't about a wasted life or missed opportunities. It was about a man who finally decided that it wasn't too late. That 56 years old wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The video of his audition went viral. Millions of people watched it. And suddenly, Richard Goodall wasn't invisible anymore. Here's something that most people don't talk about. The people closest to us often don't know our deepest secrets. Richard's family loved him. His wife supported him. His kids respected him. But there was this part of him, this massive, essential part of him, that they'd never really seen. His wife knew he could sing. She'd heard him around the house. She knew he was talented, but she didn't know the full weight of it. She didn't know that every time he listened to professional singers on the radio, something inside him ached. She didn't know that he'd spent decades making peace with a dream he'd never pursued. She didn't know that teaching music to other people's children was both a joy and a quiet heartbreak. And his kids grew up with a father who was wonderful and present and loving, but who was also somehow incomplete in a way they couldn't quite identify. They saw him pour passion into his students' musical development. They heard him critique performances with the ear of someone who understood music at a deep level. But they didn't realize their father possessed the very talent he was nurturing in others. Then came the America's Got Talent audition. Then came the viral video. Then came the moment when his family, his wife, his children, his extended relatives, watched the whole world discover something about Richard that they'd been living with their entire lives without fully understanding. His wife's reaction was emotional because she suddenly understood why her husband had always seemed to carry something with him, a longing, an incompleteness, a beautiful, painful gift that had never been fully given to the world. His children felt it too. They realized they'd grown up in the presence of extraordinary talent, and they'd never truly known it. They'd taken for granted the incredible voice of their father because it was just background noise in their lives, part of the scenery, never recognized for what it actually was. But there was also something else in their reaction, pride, deep, overwhelming pride. Because suddenly their father wasn't just a teacher or the parent or the man who went to work every day and came home and had dinner with them. He was someone exceptional. He was someone the world wanted to hear. And Richard's family finally understood that they'd always known him, but they'd never really seen him, not until the whole world saw him first. The real secret wasn't just that Richard could sing. It was deeper than that. It was about a choice so fundamental that it shaped every single day of his life for over 50 years. Richard had made a decision early on, probably without even realizing he was making it. He decided that his dream wasn't as important as his responsibility. He decided that stability mattered more than passion. He decided that a good life, a safe life, a predictable life, was worth more than the uncertain pursuit of something uncertain. And on one level, that decision made complete sense. It was practical. It was mature. It was the kind of choice that responsible adults make all the time. Millions of people make similar choices every single day. They set aside their dreams and do what needs to be done. But there's a cost to that choice. A cost that nobody really talks about until it's too late. The secret Richard carried was guilt. Not guilt about what he'd done, but guilt about what he hadn't done. It was the weight of potential unrealized. It was the voice of a younger self, whispering in the background. What if you'd been braver? What if you tried? What if you believed in yourself? And here's what makes this story even more powerful. Richard wasn't alone in carrying the secret. Millions of people are carrying the exact same thing right now. They're carrying the weight of dreams they've set aside, talents they've buried, possibilities they rejected in favor of safety. A teacher who wanted to be a writer but never wrote a book. A nurse who wanted to be a dancer but never danced professionally. An accountant who wanted to be an artist but never painted. An engineer who wanted to be a musician but never picked up an instrument. All of them carrying the same secret. All of them living with the same quiet ache. Richard's secret was also a secret about age. In our culture, we tell ourselves that certain windows close. By 30, you should have your life figured out. By 40, you should be established. By 50, it's too late to start over. By 56, that's not just late, that's impossible. But Richard didn't believe that anymore. And when he stepped onto that stage and sang, he was challenging that entire narrative. He was saying, no, the window doesn't close. Not if you don't let it. That's why his story resonated so deeply. Because it wasn't just about one man's voice. It was about everyone's voice. Everyone who'd ever silenced themselves. You don't just wake up one morning at 56 and decide to audition for America's Got Talent. There's always a trigger. Always a moment. Always something that breaks the dam you've been building for decades. For Richard, that moment came from somewhere unexpected. It wasn't a sudden crisis. It wasn't a health scare or a near-death experience. Though those things can definitely wake people up, it was something more subtle and more powerful. He started paying attention to time. When you're young, time feels infinite. You have forever to pursue your dreams. You can wait. You can prepare. You can get ready. But somewhere around 50, the math changes. You realize that you have fewer years ahead of you than behind you. You start counting differently. You start thinking in terms of how much time do I actually have left? Instead of how much time until I'm ready? Richard looked at his life and realized he'd spent 4 decades waiting. Waiting to be ready. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for permission. Waiting for circumstances to align perfectly. And the circumstances had never aligned, because they never do. Perfect circumstances don't exist. You just have to jump. But there was something else too. Something about his students. Teaching music means you're constantly surrounded by young people who are brave enough to try things, who aren't afraid to fail, who haven't yet learned all the reasons why they shouldn't pursue their dreams. And Richard spent 40 years watching them grow up and take risks and chase things that mattered to them. And at some point, that becomes unbearable. You start to wonder, why am I teaching them to be brave when I'm not brave myself? Why am I encouraging them to pursue their passions when I've abandoned mine? How can I look them in the eye and tell them to follow their dreams if I spent my entire life running away from mine? There was also the practical element. Richard's career as a teacher was stable, but it wasn't going to make him wealthy. He wasn't going to retire and travel the world. He was going to grade papers and teach classes and live a modest life. And that was fine. That was respectable. But it also meant that he had nothing to lose by trying. If he auditioned for America's Got Talent and failed, what would change? He'd still have his teaching job. He'd still have his family. He'd still have his life. But if he didn't try, he'd spend the rest of his life wondering what might have happened. So he finally decided, why not now? Why not me? Why not at 56? And he applied. The audition was just the beginning. What happened after was something Richard could never have predicted. even in his wildest imaginings. The video went viral almost immediately. We're talking millions of views within days. People were sharing it everywhere, on social media, in group chats, at work, at dinner tables. Strangers were crying watching Richard sing. People were posting about how his story inspired them, how it made them think about their own abandoned dreams, how it reminded them that it's never too late. But viral videos fade. That's what usually happens. Someone has a moment. The internet collectively watches it, and then the algorithm moves on to the next thing. Richard could have easily become a forgotten moment in the endless scroll of content, but that's not what happened. Instead, his life started changing in concrete, permanent ways. First came the performance opportunities. Concert halls that had never heard of him suddenly wanted to book him. Music festivals wanted him to perform. Churches wanted him to sing for their congregations. He went from being a substitute teacher in Indiana to being a recognized artist with actual gigs and actual opportunities. Then came the record label interest. People in the music industry started paying attention. They saw what Richard had, that rare combination of technical skill, emotional depth, and authentic humanity. Here was a man who wasn't performing because he'd been groomed for it since childhood. He wasn't performing because he was chasing fame or fortune. He was performing because he finally had permission to be himself. His America's Got Talent journey continued. He advanced through the competition. He performed in front of massive audiences. He was competing against dancers and comedians and acrobats, people who trained their entire lives for moments like this. And Richard, the substitute teacher from Indiana, was holding his own. But more than that, he was changing how people thought about possibility. Every time he performed, there were people in the audience who saw themselves in him. People who'd also set aside their dreams. People who'd also made practical choices and buried their passions. And they watched Richard and thought, maybe it's not too late for me either. His story became bigger than just his own life. It became a cultural moment, a conversation about regret and second chances, and the price we pay when we choose safety over passion. Articles were written about him. Interviews were requested. He was invited to speak about his journey. And through it all, Richard remained grounded. He didn't pretend his life before was a waste. He didn't reinvent his story to make it more dramatic than it was. He acknowledged the good things he'd done as a teacher. He honored the life he'd built, but he also honored the part of himself he'd been denying. He proved something that our culture desperately needs to hear. You can have a good life and still pursue your dream. You can be responsible and still be brave. You can wait 56 years and still make it count. When Howie Mandel pressed that golden buzzer, it wasn't random. It wasn't luck. It was recognition. Recognition of something real and rare and undeniable. The golden buzzer is supposed to be reserved for moments of genuine exceptional talent. But here's what most people don't understand. There are thousands of exceptionally talented people who audition for America's Got Talent every single year. There are singers with perfect pitch and years of professional training. There are dancers who've trained since childhood. There are acrobats who perfected their craft over decades. So, why did Howie press the button for Richard? It wasn't just the voice, though the voice was extraordinary. It was the story behind the voice. It was the humanity. It was the authenticity that you simply cannot fake, no matter how talented you are. Richard walked onto that stage as a complete unknown. He had no social media following. He had no YouTube presence. He had no pre-existing fan base. He had nothing except his voice and his story and his genuine, unfiltered emotion. And in an industry that's often built on hype and manufactured narratives and carefully constructed personas, that authenticity was shocking. Howie saw something that the other judges saw too. This was a real moment. This wasn't a calculated performance designed to go viral. This wasn't a strategic career move by someone who'd been waiting for their moment. This was a man who'd finally decided to let the world hear him. And that decision, that vulnerability, was more powerful than any technical perfection could ever be. But there's another layer to the story. The golden buzzer also represented something deeper. It represented permission. Official, public, undeniable permission for Richard to pursue something he'd been denying himself for decades. When you spend 56 years telling yourself that your dream isn't practical, that it's not realistic, that you should focus on your responsibilities instead. You need more than just your own belief. You need external validation. You need someone credible to say, no, you're not crazy. Yes, you're actually this good. Yes, this matters. Howie gave him that. The judges gave him that. The audience gave him that. And in that moment, all of Richard's doubts, the ones he'd been carrying for decades, suddenly had to confront the reality that he was actually exceptional. The golden buzzer meant he didn't have to wait for future rounds. He didn't have to prove himself incrementally. He got to skip ahead because what he had was undeniable. And that's the ultimate validation for someone who spent his entire life doubting whether his gift was real enough to matter. It also meant that Richard's story became the story of America's Got Talent that season. It became the narrative that everyone was talking about, not just because of his voice, but because of what he represented. Hope, second chances, the idea that you don't have to accept the life you built if it's not the life you actually want. Richard Goodall's story isn't really about singing. It's not about America's Got Talent or viral videos or record deals. Those are just the surface. The real story is about something that affects every single person watching. It's about the lies we tell ourselves. We tell ourselves that we're too old, that we've missed our window, that we should have started earlier, that practical choices are the only mature choices, that dreams are for other people, younger people, richer people, more talented people, people who had better circumstances. We tell ourselves these things so consistently, so convincingly, that we start to believe them. And after a while, we stop even questioning them. They just become the rules of our lives. And we follow those rules even though nobody's actually enforcing them except us. Richard spent 56 years following those rules. And then one day he decided to break them, not in a reckless way, not by abandoning his responsibilities or hurting the people he loved. He just decided that the rule about being too old wasn't actually a rule. It was just something he'd been believing. And when he made that decision, everything changed. But here's what's even more important. Millions of people watched Richard's story, and something shifted inside them too. Not everyone will audition for America's Got Talent. Most people won't. But some of them will finally call that friend they've been meaning to reconnect with. Some will finally take that class they've been thinking about. Some will finally pick up that instrument, or start that project, or pursue that passion they'd buried decades ago. Because Richard proved something crucial. You don't have to wait until everything is perfect. You don't have to wait until you're young enough or ready enough or certain enough. You just have to be brave enough to try. The bigger meaning of Richard's story is that our lives aren't fixed. They're not determined by the choices we made at 20 or 30 or 40. We can change course. We can pursue things we've abandoned. We can become versions of ourselves we thought were impossible. Age doesn't close doors unless we decide it does. Circumstance doesn't determine destiny unless we accept that it does. The past doesn't have to define the future unless we let it. Richard Goodall finally admitted what we all suspected, that there's a part of all of us that's been silenced, a part that knows we're capable of more, a part that's been waiting for permission to be heard. And maybe, just maybe, watching Richard finally give himself that permission is the nudge we all need to do the same.